Boulder, Colorado in the winter of 1996 was a place many people associated with calm routines, mountain air, and a sense of safety. It was a university town, shaped by academic life, outdoor culture, and quiet residential neighborhoods. Violent crime was rare. Families felt secure enough to leave doors unlocked and children to play freely. But on the morning after Christmas, that sense of security would vanish, replaced by shock, confusion, and a mystery that would haunt the nation for decades. In the early hours of December 26th, a call came into emergency services reporting a kidnapping. A young girl was missing. A ransom note had been found inside her home. What initially appeared to be a kidnapping case would soon become something far darker, exposing investigative failures, destroying reputations, and creating one of the most debated criminal cases in American history. Her name was John Benét Ramsay. She was 6 years old. For nearly 3 decades, her case has been examined by law enforcement agencies, forensic scientists, behavioral analysts, journalists, and millions of people around the world. Every detail has been scrutinized, every theory argued, every mistake replayed. Some believed the crime could only have been committed by someone inside the home. Others believed an intruder was responsible. The accusations were relentless, the speculation unforgiving, and the truth remained buried beneath layers of error, bias, and lost evidence. Now, decades later, advances in forensic science have reopened doors that once seemed permanently closed. DNA technology that did not exist at the time of John Benét's death has given investigators new tools, new hope, and potentially new answers. Genetic genealogy, the same method that identified the Golden State Killer after more than 40 years, has been applied to evidence collected in 1996. Investigators have confirmed that the case is active, evolving, and closer to resolution than ever before. This is not a story about rumors or sensationalism. This is a factual examination of what happened, what went wrong, and what science may still reveal. This is forensic true crime. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps us continue producing long-form, evidence-based true crime documentaries focused on accuracy, respect, and truth. To understand the significance of this case, it is essential to understand who John Benét Ramsay was beyond the headlines and tabloid images that would later define public perception. John Benét Patricia Ramsay was born in August of 1990 in Atlanta, Georgia. Her name was a combination of her father's first and middle names, John Benét. She was the youngest child in the Ramsay family. Her father, John Ramsay, was a successful businessman who founded Access Graphics, a computer services company that would later become a subsidiary of Lockheed Martin. By the mid-1990s, he was financially successful and respected within Boulder's business community. His career required travel, long hours, and leadership, but those who knew him described him as devoted to his family. Her mother, Patsy Ramsay, was a former Miss West Virginia who had graduated from West Virginia University. She was active in her church, social circles, and community organizations. Friends described her as outgoing, warm, and deeply invested in her children's lives. She had survived a previous battle with cancer and viewed family life as something to be cherished. John Benét had one older brother, Burke, who was 9 years old at the time. She also had adult half-siblings from her father's previous marriage, though they did not live in the Boulder home. The family resided in a large Tudor-style house on 15th Street, located in one of Boulder's more affluent neighborhoods. The home was spacious, with multiple floors, numerous rooms, and a basement that included storage areas and a small windowless room later referred to as the wine cellar. Those who interacted with John Benét described her as lively and affectionate. She enjoyed singing, music lessons, school activities, and church events. She was known to be social, outgoing, and confident for her age. She participated in children's beauty pageants, an activity encouraged by her mother, and one that John Benét appeared to enjoy. While this aspect of her life would later be heavily criticized, at the time it was one of many activities in which she participated. In the months leading up to Christmas of 1996, there were no reports of unusual behavior, threats, or concerns involving the family. John Benét attended school regularly. She had friends. She was preparing for holiday activities and performances. Life appeared normal. Christmas Day arrived with celebration and routine. The Ramsay family spent the morning opening gifts at home. That evening, they attended a holiday gathering at the home of close friends. According to witnesses, the event was pleasant and uneventful. The children played, the adults socialized, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. Later that night, the family returned home. According to John and Patsy Ramsay, both children had fallen asleep during the drive. John Benét was carried upstairs and placed in her bed. Burke went to his room. The parents retired to their bedroom on the upper floor. The house grew quiet. Sometime during the night, something catastrophic occurred. In the early morning hours of December 26th, Patsy Ramsay woke to begin preparing for a planned family trip. As she descended the stairs, she noticed several sheets of paper placed on the staircase. They were handwritten. As she began reading, panic set in. The note claimed that her daughter had been kidnapped. At 5:52 in the morning, emergency services received the call. Patsy Ramsay's voice was frantic as she reported that her daughter was missing and a ransom note had been left. Police were dispatched immediately. What followed in the hours after that call would shape the course of the investigation and define the controversy surrounding this case for decades to come. When officers from the Boulder Police Department arrived at the Ramsay residence in the early morning hours of December 26, 1996, they were stepping into what they believed was an active kidnapping investigation. The ransom note left little room for hesitation. It warned against contacting law enforcement, demanded a specific amount of money, and threatened harm to John Benét if its instructions were not followed. Despite those warnings, the decision to call police was immediate, driven by fear, confusion, and hope that authorities could help bring the child home safely. The first responding officer entered the house just minutes after the call. Patsy Ramsay was visibly distraught. John Ramsay appeared tense but controlled. The ransom note was quickly examined. It was unusually long, spanning multiple pages, and written in black ink on paper that was later confirmed to have come from inside the home. The note referenced a foreign faction, criticized John Ramsay's business success, and demanded a ransom amount of $118,000, a figure nearly identical to John Ramsay's recent company bonus. From the beginning, the note raised questions. Kidnapping ransom notes are typically brief, designed to communicate demands quickly and efficiently. This note was theatrical, detailed, and oddly personal. It included references to movies, warnings about police involvement, and specific instructions regarding delivery of the ransom. The tone shifted between threatening and almost taunting. Even experienced investigators would later describe it as one of the most unusual ransom notes they had ever seen. Despite these red flags, the situation was treated as a kidnapping. Officers conducted a cursory search of the home to determine whether there were signs of forced entry or immediate danger. No clear signs were found. Doors and windows appeared intact. There was no obvious point of entry. This absence of visible evidence complicated the picture but did not rule out the possibility of an intruder. One of the most critical moments in the case occurred during these early hours. The house was not secured as a crime scene. Friends, family members, and a pastor were allowed to come to the home for support. They moved freely through rooms, sat on furniture, cleaned surfaces, and unintentionally disturbed potential evidence. At the time, the focus remained on the ransom note and the expectation that John Benét was alive and would be returned. Detectives waited for the phone call promised in the ransom note. According to the note, the call was supposed to come between 8 and 10 in the morning. Hours passed. The phone never rang. Anxiety grew. Confusion deepened. As time went on, the absence of communication from the supposed kidnappers became increasingly concerning. At one point, John Ramsay was instructed by police to search the house from top to bottom for anything unusual. This decision would later be heavily criticized. During this search, John and a family friend went to the basement. There, in a small windowless room used primarily for storage, John made a discovery that would change everything. John Benét's body was found on the floor. She was unresponsive. She had been bound with cord around her wrists. A garrote had been used to strangle her. She was still dressed in the clothes she had worn to bed. There was no sign that she had ever left the house. The kidnapping investigation instantly became a homicide investigation. Police sealed the home, but by then the damage to the crime scene had already been done. Evidence had been contaminated. Footprints overlapped. Objects had been moved. The timeline of events became blurred beyond recovery. John Benét's body was transported for autopsy. Investigators began the grim task of determining how she had died and when. The initial shock quickly gave way to a more complex and disturbing reality. The autopsy revealed that John Benét had suffered a severe fracture to her skull. Medical examiners concluded that the blow was powerful and would have rendered her unconscious. Evidence suggested that this injury occurred before the strangulation. The garrote, made from a piece of cord and a broken paintbrush handle, had been tightened around her neck with significant force. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation associated with head trauma. These findings raised immediate questions. If John Benét had been struck and incapacitated, why was she later strangled? What sequence of events led from injury to death? And who would have access to materials inside the home to fashion a weapon? As details of the case began to emerge, media attention exploded. News crews descended on Boulder. The Ramsay home became a focal point for reporters. Speculation filled the airwaves. Within days, the case shifted from a local tragedy to a national obsession. Investigators faced immense pressure. The public demanded answers. The media demanded suspects. And in the absence of clear evidence pointing to an outsider, attention began to turn inward. The Ramsay family, once viewed as victims of a horrific crime, soon found themselves under intense scrutiny. Their behavior, their statements, and even their grief were analyzed frame by frame. Innocent actions were interpreted as suspicious. Emotional responses were judged against expectations shaped by television dramas rather than real human trauma. John and Patsy Ramsay cooperated with police initially, providing statements and allowing interviews. However, tensions between the family and law enforcement soon emerged. Disagreements over investigative strategy, concerns about fairness, and growing mistrust began to erode cooperation. Attorneys were hired. Communication became formal and guarded. Meanwhile, forensic evidence was being processed. Fibers, fingerprints, handwriting samples, and DNA were collected. The ransom note underwent extensive analysis. Handwriting experts examined Patsy Ramsay's writing, comparing it to the note. Opinions varied. Some experts believed she could not be excluded as the author. Others disagreed, stating there was insufficient evidence to make such a conclusion. The lack of consensus fueled speculation, rather than clarity. As days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. No arrests were made. No clear suspects were identified. Leads came in from across the country, many of them false or misguided. Tips overwhelmed investigators but yielded little progress. Behind the scenes, one piece of evidence quietly stood apart from the rest. DNA recovered from John Benét's clothing did not match anyone in the Ramsay family. At the time, DNA technology was still evolving. The significance of this finding would not be fully understood for years. For now, the investigation was mired in uncertainty, conflict, and public pressure. The truth seemed buried beneath layers of assumption and error. And as the world watched, a little girl's murder remained unanswered. As the weeks following John Benét Ramsay's death turned into months, the investigation entered a phase defined by uncertainty, internal conflict, and mounting public pressure. What should have been a meticulous forensic process became fractured, shaped as much by media narratives as by physical evidence. The absence of a clear suspect allowed speculation to flourish, and soon the focus of the investigation shifted away from unknown intruders toward the people closest to John Benét. Law enforcement began examining the family's actions with increasing intensity. Every statement given by John and Patsy Ramsay was compared, reanalyzed, and challenged. Minor inconsistencies, common in traumatic situations, were magnified and interpreted as signs of deception. The timing of events, the order of movements within the house, and even the parents' emotional responses became subjects of suspicion. Public opinion followed suit. Television commentators and tabloid headlines questioned how a child could be murdered inside her own home without the knowledge of her family. The complexity of the crime was often reduced to simplistic assumptions. The possibility of an intruder was dismissed by many as unlikely, despite the lack of definitive evidence supporting an internal perpetrator. Meanwhile, the ransom note continued to dominate discussion. Investigators remained deeply divided over its origin. Handwriting experts examined letter shapes, spacing, pressure, and style. Some believed the note bore similarities to Patsy Ramsay's handwriting, while others stated just as firmly that it did not. No expert could conclusively identify the author. Despite this, public perception increasingly treated the note as proof of parental involvement. The note's length and content raised additional questions. It appeared to have been written calmly, without haste, using materials from inside the home. Whoever wrote it had time. They had privacy. They were familiar with the house, or at least that is what many believed. Others argued that an intruder could have entered earlier, waited until the family slept, and used what was available. Forensic evidence offered little clarity. Fibers found on John Benét's clothing were consistent with materials found in the home, but that was not unexpected given where she lived. No clear fingerprints were recovered that could be definitively linked to a suspect. Footprints found near the body did not provide a usable lead. As the investigation stalled, tensions between the Ramsay family and the Boulder Police Department worsened. The family felt targeted rather than protected. Investigators felt stonewalled. Requests for follow-up interviews became contentious. The Ramsays eventually moved out of Boulder, seeking privacy and safety from relentless media attention. In January of 1997, John Benét Ramsay was laid to rest in Georgia. The funeral was private, but the grief was public. Images of the ceremony circulated widely, further fueling commentary and judgment. For many watching from afar, the case had already taken on a narrative of guilt or innocence, often without regard for evidence. Behind closed doors, investigators continued to pursue leads. One area of focus was the possibility of prior access to the home. The Ramsays, housekeeper and her family, were investigated. Contractors, delivery workers, and acquaintances were interviewed. None were charged. No evidence emerged that could place any of them at the scene during the time of the murder. The notion of an intruder remained controversial. Critics argued that there were no signs of forced entry. Supporters of the theory pointed out that several doors and windows were often left unlocked, and that a basement window had shown signs of disturbance. The question of whether that disturbance was recent or old remained unresolved. Amid the uncertainty, forensic testing continued quietly. One of the most important developments involved DNA. Early testing had identified a small amount of genetic material recovered from John Benét's underwear. At the time, the sample was too limited to provide definitive answers. Still, it did not match anyone in the family. This fact was noted but largely overshadowed by louder narratives. As months passed with no resolution, the case grew colder. The public, however, remained captivated. Books were written, television specials aired, theories multiplied. Each new interpretation added another layer of complexity, often blurring the line between fact and speculation. In the late 1990s, a grand jury was convened to review evidence and determine whether charges should be filed. This move suggested progress, but the outcome would only deepen the mystery. After months of testimony, the grand jury voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsay on charges related to child abuse, resulting in death and accessory to a crime. However, the district attorney declined to file the charges, citing insufficient evidence to secure a conviction. The existence of the grand jury's decision was not publicly revealed for years. When it eventually became known, it reignited debate and confusion. Some viewed it as proof of guilt. Others emphasized that a grand jury indictment does not equate to a finding of guilt, and that the district attorney's refusal to prosecute spoke volumes about the weakness of the case. The Ramsays continued to maintain their innocence. They pursued defamation lawsuits against media outlets that accused them of wrongdoing. Several of these cases were settled or resolved in the family's favor, reinforcing the lack of concrete evidence against them. As the new millennium approached, the John Benét Ramsay case stood as a cautionary tale of how investigations can be derailed by early mistakes, media pressure, and public bias. The crime remained unsolved. The killer, whoever it was, had not been identified. Yet quietly, science was advancing. DNA technology was improving at a rapid pace. Methods that once required large samples could now work with trace amounts. The evidence collected in 1996, preserved despite early mishandling, held new potential. What had once been dismissed as inconclusive would soon take on new significance. By the early 2000s, the John Benét Ramsay case had become a symbol of unresolved tragedy and investigative controversy. Public attention had ebbed and flowed, but the pain endured by those closest to the case never truly faded. While the headlines grew quieter, work continued behind the scenes, driven by new leadership, evolving forensic methods, and renewed interest in evidence that had long been overlooked or misunderstood. In 2003, the Boulder District Attorney's Office brought in new forensic experts to re-examine the physical evidence using updated technology. Among the most significant items were the clothing John Benét had been wearing at the time of her death. Advances in DNA testing allowed analysts to extract and amplify genetic material that had previously been too limited to interpret. The results were striking. The DNA profile recovered from John Benét's underwear did not match any member of the Ramsay family. Further testing revealed that this same unknown male DNA profile appeared on the waistband of her long underwear. The consistency suggested a single contributor rather than random contamination. This finding shifted the conversation in a profound way. In 2008, then, Boulder District Attorney publicly announced that John and Patsy Ramsay were no longer considered suspects. The statement cited the DNA evidence as a key factor in clearing the family. For the first time in years, the official narrative moved away from internal suspicion and back toward the possibility of an unknown perpetrator. This announcement was met with mixed reactions. Supporters of the Ramsay family viewed it as long overdue vindication. Critics argued that the DNA evidence was insufficient or possibly the result of innocent transfer during manufacturing or handling of the clothing. The debate reignited old divisions, with experts on both sides offering competing interpretations. Despite the controversy, one fact remained unchanged. The DNA profile did not belong to anyone known to investigators at the time. It was entered into national databases, but no matches were found. The identity of the contributor remained unknown. The case entered a new phase, one defined less by accusation and more by patience. Investigators acknowledged that the answer might not come quickly. The evidence would need time, technology, and the right breakthrough. Meanwhile, the human toll continued. Patsy Ramsay passed away in 2006 after a recurrence of cancer. She died without seeing the case resolved or her daughter's killer identified. John Ramsay, now widowed, continued to advocate for renewed investigation and the use of modern forensic tools. Burke Ramsay, once a child at the center of unwanted attention, grew into adulthood largely out of the public eye. The years following saw renewed interest in cold cases nationwide. Advances in genetic genealogy transformed the landscape of criminal investigation. High-profile cases that had remained unsolved for decades were suddenly being closed, thanks to DNA profiles uploaded to public genealogy databases and matched through distant relatives. Law enforcement agencies across the country began revisiting cases once thought impossible to solve. The John Benét Ramsay case was no exception. By the late 2010s, investigators confirmed that genetic genealogy was being applied to the unknown DNA profile in this case. Unlike traditional DNA matching, which relies on direct matches in criminal databases, genetic genealogy searches for partial matches that indicate familial relationships. These relationships can then be traced through family trees to identify potential suspects. The process is complex and time-consuming. It requires careful analysis, ethical oversight, and cooperation with genealogy services, but its success in other cases offered hope. Officials emphasized that the investigation remained active. Evidence was being retested. Leads were being evaluated. While no arrests had been announced, the renewed effort signaled a commitment to resolution rather than resignation. Throughout this period, public interest resurfaced through documentaries, podcasts, and renewed media coverage. Many of these works attempted to correct misinformation and focus on verified facts. Others continued to sensationalize the case, perpetuating myths and fueling controversy. For those working the case, the challenge was balancing transparency with integrity. Releasing too much information could compromise the investigation. Releasing too little risked public distrust. Investigators walked a careful line, aware that every statement would be dissected and debated. At its core, the case remained about one child. John Benét Ramsay was not an abstraction or a symbol. She was a real person whose life ended violently and unjustly. Every piece of evidence represented not just a clue, but a chance to speak for someone who could no longer speak for herself. As technology advanced and databases grew, the possibility of identifying the unknown DNA contributor became more realistic. The question was no longer whether science could help, but whether enough usable evidence remained, and whether the right connections would be made. The passage of time had not erased the crime. It had only sharpened the need for answers. As the investigation moved deeper into the era of modern forensic science, the John Benét Ramsay case began to be viewed through a different lens. No longer defined solely by early missteps and public suspicion, it became an example of how evolving technology can breathe new life into long-dormant cases. Yet, with renewed hope came renewed challenges, particularly in separating legitimate evidence from decades of speculation. One of the most persistent points of debate remained the unknown DNA profile. Critics continued to argue that the genetic material could have been transferred during manufacturing or packaging of John Benét's clothing. Supporters of the intruder theory countered that the presence of the same DNA profile on multiple items suggested a single source connected to the crime itself. Forensic experts weighed in from both sides, each interpretation grounded in scientific reasoning, but shaped by differing assumptions. What made the DNA evidence especially significant was its location. The genetic material was found in areas directly associated with the assault, not on outer garments or random surfaces. This fact did not prove guilt, but it raised questions that could not be easily dismissed. Investigators treated the DNA as a critical lead, one that warranted exhaustive analysis rather than casual explanation. Beyond DNA, attention returned to the physical layout of the Ramsay home. The house was large and complex, with multiple entry points, staircases, and rooms. Critics of the intruder theory often describe the home as impenetrable. Those familiar with the property disagreed, noting that doors and windows were frequently left unlocked and that the basement offered access points not visible from the street. Investigators re-examined reports of a basement window that had been found open. John Ramsay had stated that he had broken the window months earlier after locking himself out of the house. Whether the window had been disturbed on the night of the murder remained unclear. No conclusive evidence tied the window directly to the crime, but its existence kept the possibility of an intruder alive. The garrote used in the killing continued to trouble investigators. It was constructed from a piece of cord and a broken paintbrush handle, the latter traced to a set belonging to Patsy Ramsay. This detail was frequently cited as evidence of an inside job. Others argued that an intruder could have easily used materials found in the home to fashion a weapon, especially if they had time and privacy. The question of time remained central. Whoever committed the crime appeared to have spent a significant amount of time inside the house. They wrote a lengthy ransom note, constructed a weapon, and moved through multiple floors without being detected. This level of access suggested familiarity or confidence. Whether that confidence came from living in the home or from careful planning remained unresolved. As years passed, law enforcement agencies refined their approach to cold cases. Rather than focusing on single theories, they adopted multidisciplinary reviews, bringing together forensic scientists, behavioral analysts, and investigators with no prior involvement in the case. This fresh perspective helped eliminate tunnel vision and reassess long-held assumptions. In the John Benét Ramsay case, these reviews highlighted how early investigative decisions had shaped everything that followed. The failure to secure the crime scene had cost irreplaceable evidence. Delayed interviews had allowed memories to fade. Public narratives had influenced investigative priorities. Acknowledging these mistakes was painful but necessary. The renewed focus on genetic genealogy brought cautious optimism. Investigators confirmed that they were working to identify relatives of the unknown DNA contributor. This process required building extensive family trees, sometimes stretching back generations. Each potential connection had to be verified through additional testing and documentation. Progress was slow and often invisible to the public. False leads emerged and were discarded. Potential matches failed to pan out. Still, investigators persisted, aware that even a distant relative could eventually lead them to the right person. Throughout this time, John Ramsay continued to speak publicly, urging authorities to do everything possible to solve his daughter's murder. His appeals were measured and consistent, focused on science rather than blame. He emphasized that the case was not about defending a family's reputation, but about finding the truth. Public reaction remained divided. Some continued to believe the answers lay within the family. Others accepted the possibility that the original narrative had been flawed. For many, the case had become a reflection of broader issues in criminal justice, including media influence, confirmation bias, and the evolution of forensic science. As the investigation pressed forward, one reality remained unchanged. Somewhere the truth existed, encoded in evidence that had survived for decades. Whether that evidence would finally speak depended on patience, precision, and the willingness to let facts, not assumptions, lead the way. By the early 2020s, the John Benét Ramsay case had reached a critical crossroads. Nearly 3 decades had passed since the crime, yet advances in forensic science continued to offer new avenues of investigation. What once seemed like an unsolvable tragedy was now being approached with tools capable of uncovering truths hidden for generations. Genetic genealogy had already transformed the landscape of criminal investigation. Cases long considered cold were being solved through distant familial DNA matches. Investigators in the Ramsay case confirmed that they were applying these same techniques, carefully navigating legal and ethical guidelines. Every step required precision. A single misinterpretation could send the investigation down the wrong path. Unlike traditional DNA matching, genetic genealogy does not rely on direct identification. Instead, it identifies potential relatives of an unknown contributor. These relatives may share only a small percentage of DNA, but that connection can be enough to build a family tree. From there, investigators narrow the pool of individuals based on age, location, and opportunity. This process is painstaking. It can take months or even years to construct accurate genealogical maps. Each branch must be verified using historical records, birth certificates, and other documentation. In some cases, entire lines are eliminated. In others, new possibilities emerge. Law enforcement agencies working on the case have been careful in their public statements. They have emphasized that the investigation remains active, but they have avoided releasing details that could compromise progress. This restraint has been both praised and criticized. Some view the silence as necessary. Others see it as a lack of transparency. Behind the scenes, forensic analysts have continued to re-examine physical evidence with updated techniques. Improvements in DNA amplification and contamination detection have allowed for more confident interpretations of samples collected decades earlier. Analysts have worked to distinguish between DNA likely related to the crime and DNA that could have been introduced through innocent means. This distinction is crucial. The strength of any eventual case depends on the ability to demonstrate that genetic material is directly connected to the criminal act. Investigators must be prepared to defend their conclusions in court, where standards of proof are rigorous. As attention returned to the case, discussions also revisited the psychological and behavioral aspects of the crime. Behavioral analysts considered what kind of individual could commit such an act. The crime involved elements of planning and improvisation, suggesting a complex psychological profile. The use of a ransom note, the staging of the scene, and the location of the body all pointed to someone attempting to misdirect investigators. Whether this misdirection came from an intruder or someone familiar with the household remained a point of debate. Analysts examined patterns from similar crimes, searching for parallels that could provide insight. While no definitive match emerged, the exercise helped refine investigative focus. The role of the media was also reassessed. Early coverage of the case had often blurred the line between reporting and speculation. Sensational headlines had shaped public perception long before facts were established. In later years, more responsible reporting sought to correct misinformation and present evidence in context. For the Ramsay family, the renewed attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought hope that the case might finally be solved. On the other, it reopened old wounds and revived suspicions they had lived with for decades. Burke Ramsay, now an adult, had largely avoided public life, but his childhood had been marked by scrutiny he never chose. The emotional weight of the case extended beyond the family. Investigators who had worked the case carried the burden of unresolved responsibility. New detectives inherited a legacy of mistakes and unanswered questions. For them, solving the case was not just about justice for John Benét, but about restoring faith in the investigative process. As the years progressed, collaboration between agencies increased. Cold case units, forensic laboratories, and genealogical experts shared information and resources. This cooperative approach reflected a broader shift in law enforcement, recognizing that complex cases often require interdisciplinary solutions. Despite the progress, uncertainty remained. Genetic genealogy does not guarantee identification. Some DNA contributors may have no relatives in accessible databases. Others may lead investigators down paths that end in dead ends. Success depends on a combination of luck, persistence, and data availability. Yet for the first time in years, the path forward felt tangible. The case was no longer defined solely by what went wrong in 1996, but by what could still be done today. As the investigation pressed forward, the passage of time itself became both an obstacle and an ally. Memories faded, witnesses aged, and some individuals connected to the case passed away. At the same time, distance from the original chaos allowed for clearer analysis, free from the emotional intensity that had once clouded judgment. Investigators revisited earlier assumptions with fresh eyes. The early focus on the family, while understandable given the circumstances, was now examined as a potential example of confirmation bias. Once a narrative takes hold, it can influence how evidence is interpreted. Modern cold case reviews aim to dismantle those narratives and rebuild conclusions from the ground up. In the John Benét Ramsay case, this meant re-examining every decision made in the first 48 hours. The failure to secure the crime scene, the delayed separation of witnesses, and the absence of immediate forensic control were acknowledged as critical errors. These mistakes did not prove guilt or innocence, but they limited the ability to reconstruct events accurately. The ransom note remained one of the most perplexing elements. Behavioral analysts continued to debate its purpose. Some believed it was written to mislead investigators and buy time. Others argued it reflected a desire for control or recognition. The language was inconsistent, shifting between authority and insecurity, which suggested emotional volatility. The specificity of the ransom amount continued to draw attention. It mirrored John Ramsay's recent bonus, a detail that was publicly known to some within his business circle. Whether this knowledge indicated an inside source or coincidental access remained unresolved. Investigators explored who might have known this information and how widely it had circulated. Attention also returned to the timeline of injuries. Medical experts reaffirmed that the head injury preceded the strangulation. This sequence suggested a period of unconsciousness before death. The implications were significant. It raised questions about intent, awareness, and opportunity. The act of strangulation required time and effort, indicating a deliberate decision rather than a moment of panic. This deliberate aspect of the crime challenged simplistic theories. It suggested planning, control, and a willingness to spend time at risk. Whether that risk was taken by someone confident they would not be interrupted or by someone desperate to complete the act remained an open question. As investigators built profiles and explored genealogical leads, they remained mindful of the legal standards required for prosecution. Identifying a suspect is only the first step. Establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt requires corroborating evidence, reliable timelines, and clear connections between the suspect and the crime scene. The age of the case complicates this process. Physical evidence degrades, records are lost, witnesses may no longer be available. Each missing piece increases the burden on remaining evidence. Despite these challenges, investigators continued their work. They pursued every credible lead generated through genetic genealogy. Each potential relative was examined in context, considering proximity to Boulder at the time, criminal history, and possible motives. In parallel, discussions emerged about the broader implications of the case. John Benét Ramsay's murder became a case study in how not to handle high-profile investigations. Training programs cited it as an example of the consequences of early errors and media interference. At the same time, it highlighted the resilience of science and the possibility of redemption through technological progress. Public interest persisted, driven by a desire for closure. For many, the case symbolized unfinished business, a lingering injustice that demanded resolution. Online forums, documentaries, and academic analyses continued to explore the evidence, often with greater care than in the early years. Throughout it all, the focus returned again and again to John Benét herself. She was a child whose life was cut short, whose identity became overshadowed by theories and arguments. Investigators and advocates alike emphasized the need to center the case on her, not on spectacle or blame. As the investigation approached its third decade, hope and caution existed side by side. Hope that science would finally identify the person responsible. Caution that even with identification, justice might remain elusive due to legal and practical barriers. Still, the pursuit continued, driven by the belief that truth, once uncovered, has the power to restore dignity and provide answers long denied. As investigators moved closer to the present day, the John Benét Ramsay case existed in a delicate balance between progress and restraint. Every new development carried the weight of expectation, yet authorities understood that premature conclusions could undo years of careful work. The case had taught hard lessons about haste, assumption, and public pressure. Genetic genealogy efforts continued quietly. Analysts refined family trees, eliminated branches, and revisited records that had once seemed insignificant. Old addresses, employment histories, and travel records were rechecked. What once might have been dismissed as irrelevant now carried potential meaning when viewed through the lens of DNA relationships. Each potential lead required confirmation through additional testing. Investigators sought direct DNA samples when legally permissible, comparing them to the unknown profile recovered from the crime scene. Many comparisons led nowhere. Others raised questions that required further scrutiny. Progress was incremental, often invisible, but persistent. At the same time, the case renewed conversations about victims' rights and investigative accountability. John Benét's murder highlighted how easily a victim's story can be overtaken by speculation. Advocates argued that future cases must prioritize evidence preservation, trauma-informed policing, and ethical media coverage to prevent similar outcomes. The legal framework surrounding genetic genealogy also evolved. Courts and legislatures debated privacy concerns, consent, and the limits of investigative use. Law enforcement agencies adopted stricter guidelines to ensure that the pursuit of justice did not infringe on civil liberties. These safeguards, while necessary, added layers of complexity to an already challenging process. For the Ramsay family, the years brought a mixture of resilience and fatigue. John Ramsay continued to speak publicly, not with anger, but with determination. He emphasized that time should not be an excuse for inaction, and that his daughter deserved the same commitment given to any other victim. His advocacy kept the case visible without inflaming controversy. Burke Ramsay, whose childhood had been shaped by loss and suspicion, maintained his privacy. His life served as a reminder that unresolved cases ripple outward, affecting not only victims but also those left behind. The long-term psychological impact of such scrutiny became part of the broader discussion surrounding the case. Public perception slowly shifted. While debates remained, there was growing acknowledgement that early narratives may have oversimplified a complex crime. Greater appreciation emerged for the role of forensic science and the dangers of drawing conclusions without sufficient evidence. Investigators also revisited comparisons to other cases. Similar crimes involving child victims, ransom notes, or staged scenes were analyzed for patterns. While no definitive parallels emerged, the exercise helped contextualize the crime and refine investigative theories. Throughout this phase, one principle guided the work: follow the evidence wherever it leads. This commitment marked a departure from earlier years when theories often dictated interpretation. Now, evidence took precedence, even when it challenged long-held beliefs. The possibility of resolution, once distant, felt closer than ever. Yet investigators remained realistic. Not all cases end with courtroom trials or public confessions. Sometimes, resolution comes in the form of identification without prosecution, truth without punishment. Even that, many believed, would bring a measure of peace. As the case approached 3 decades unresolved, its significance extended beyond a single crime. It became a testament to the enduring impact of violence, the evolution of justice, and the responsibility society holds toward its most vulnerable members. The story was not over. The final chapter had yet to be written. Nearly 3 decades after the murder of John Benét Ramsay, the case remains one of the most haunting and consequential investigations in modern American history. What began as a frantic call on a quiet winter morning evolved into a national reckoning with how crimes are investigated, reported, and remembered. The passage of time has not erased the questions. Instead, it has sharpened the need for answers grounded in evidence rather than assumption. Before we continue toward the conclusion of this documentary, take a moment to support this channel. If you value careful, fact-based true crime reporting, please like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Forensic True Crime. Your engagement helps ensure that cases like this are examined with respect, accuracy, and integrity. Today, the investigation continues in a form very different from the one that unfolded in 1996. The urgency remains, but it is now guided by patience, science, and a determination to avoid repeating past mistakes. Genetic genealogy, advanced DNA testing, and multidisciplinary collaboration represent the most powerful tools currently available to investigators. While no public announcements have confirmed a suspect, authorities have stated that the case is active and that forensic leads are still being pursued. The legacy of this case extends far beyond Boulder, Colorado. It has influenced how law enforcement secures crime scenes, how prosecutors evaluate evidence, and how the media approaches high-profile investigations. Training programs reference it as a reminder that early decisions can shape outcomes for decades. Forensic science courses study it as an example of both the limitations of past methods and the promise of modern technology. At the center of it all is John Benét herself. She was 6 years old. She was a child with a family who loved her, a future full of possibility, and a life that ended in violence she did nothing to deserve. Her name became known around the world, but notoriety was never the point. Justice was. For the Ramsay family, the years have been marked by loss, endurance, and unanswered questions. Patsy Ramsay did not live to see the renewed investigative efforts driven by modern science. John Ramsay continues to speak out, not as a figure seeking attention, but as a father advocating for truth. Burke Ramsay, whose childhood was shaped by tragedy and scrutiny, represents the quiet, lasting impact of unresolved trauma. The public also plays a role in how this case is remembered. Sensationalism can obscure facts. Speculation can cause harm. Responsible engagement, grounded in evidence and compassion, can help ensure that justice remains the focus rather than blame. The evolution of public conversation around this case reflects a growing awareness of that responsibility. Whether this investigation ultimately leads to an arrest, a confession, or a definitive identification through DNA, its significance will endure. It stands as a reminder that justice is not always immediate, but it must always be pursued. Time does not diminish the value of truth. It only tests our resolve to uncover it. As forensic science continues to advance, evidence preserved for decades may finally provide answers. When that happens, it will not only resolve long-standing questions, but also reaffirm a fundamental principle. Every victim matters, regardless of how much time has passed. If this documentary helped you better understand the facts, the failures, and the ongoing pursuit of justice in this case, remember to like the video, share your perspective in the comments, and subscribe to Forensic True Crime for more evidence-based investigations. Justice delayed does not have to mean justice denied.